few weeks ago, I released a video which showed the construction of the first 5 members of my Primaris kill team. I wanted to expand on this group into a full roster, and I thought that I would show you the first 2 additions to the group. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how I set about building both a Primaris Scout and a Heavy Specialist too. I began with the Primaris Scout, Ola's Col. I imagine this particular squad member as being similar to how the Space Wolves use their scouts. Rather than being populated by the new recruits of the chapter, these scouts are made up of veterans, or at least fully fledged Primaris. As such, I wanted something that had the size and appearance of a Primaris Marine, albeit with much lighter armour and equipment. The best place to source these correctly scaled components was the Goliath gang kit from Necromunda. So I began by removing the parts required to build the torso and legs of a Goliath ganger. These components were then cleaned up with my scalpel. While the Goliath kit offered me the required bulk to represent a Primaris Marine, I still needed to add the lighter armour and something that would link the model to the other members of the kill team. The simplest solution was to grab the torso from a Phobos wearing Marine such as an Intercessor or a Reaver. The front half of this armoured torso stopped at the belt, so it made the most sense to use this as the cut-off point. The back half of the torso still retained the back of the legs, so these needed to be removed. I used my saw and cut just below the belt, using the existing seam as a guide. Once removed, I used my knife to clean up the cut. The Goliath torso features an armoured belt, and I decided to saw just below this too. However, as it got wider towards the front, I started my sawing at the back, positioning my saw just below the bottom edge of the belt. I sawed all the way through until the legs were separated from the torso and cleaned up the edge of the cut with my knife. At this point, I compared the Phobos torso against the Goliath legs to see how they were lining up. I could see that the legs still needed a few more trims. I shaved back and rounded out the top edge of the legs so they would appear to pinch in towards the belt, whilst also flattening out the top of the legs at the same time. I also found that the Phobos belt buckle was conflicting with some of the Goliath belts that was still visible. I trimmed this back until the torso and the legs were fitting together a little better. Before I began assembling anything, I still needed to make a few adjustments to the torso. The first of these was the removal of the symbol from the chest. Like the rest of my kill team, I wanted to maximise the surface area to add additional pouches, but also to represent the more pragmatic approach that the Raptors have. This was done with my scalpel. I started by carefully shaving away the symbol before using my knife in a perpendicular motion to achieve a smooth surface. The final adjustment to the torso saw me clip away the tab from the back of the torso. I wasn't planning on using a regular power pack here, so this would not be needed. I started with my clippers and then smoothed out the surface with my knife. With all the adjustments done, I then glued together the torso and the legs. With the torso and the legs in place, I next needed to work on the arms. Here I had 2 problems to solve. The first being the scale. I needed something that would be proportional to a Primaris Marine. But I couldn't just use regular Primaris arms, as their armoured nature would have looked odd against the lightly armoured legs. Fortunately, my solution came from the Goliath kit once again. The muscle arms are the perfect scale, and their distinct lack of armour helps to convey the more lightly armoured nature of Ola's Col's scout role. However, I didn't want to use the hand that the arm came with. Instead, I would be using this bolt carbine from the Intercessor kit. But before I could attach this, I first needed to adjust the shoulder of the arm to ensure that I could attach the Phobos torso. I compared the arm and found that I need to flatten out the joint in order to get any sort of fit. These arms are designed for a very particular joint, so I wasn't expecting the perfect fit here. I just needed to be able to glue it for the time being. Before I attached the arm though, I chose to attach the Primaris hand to the arm. I started by clipping away the Goliath's axe-carrying hand and trimming back the cut to create a flat surface. I compared the fit of the wrist to ensure that the trims I was making were correct, before first gluing the hand to the arm and then gluing the arm to the torso. I was left with a gap here, but that would be resolved later on. Much like the left arm, the right was also taken from the Goliath kit, and like before, I also intended on swapping out the grenade-carrying hand for an armoured knife-throwing one instead. I first trimmed the shoulder to ensure that I could get a good fit against the flat surface before then removing the hand. Again, I used my clippers to remove the bulk of the hand whilst trying not to damage the wrist armour in the process. This was then cleaned up with my knife to create a flat surface. This knife throwing arm was also taken from the Intercessor set, but as I only needed the hand, I set about using my saw to remove it, starting just above that wrist plate. This would give me the cleanest cut and retain as much of the hand and arm as possible. Once cut away, I cleaned up the cut, attaching it to the arm and finally gluing the arm to the torso. To fix the now gaping holes that had been left in the arm joints, I turned to the trusty green stuff. I cut away equal parts yellow and blue whilst leaving that middle joint alone. This part of the putty can often have already cured and can leave a gritty texture in your putty. I mixed the two colours together and then rolled out a small section of it into a small sausage shape that was ever so slightly thicker than the gap in the left shoulder. This meant that when I pressed the green stuff into that gap, I would have a slight protruding excess. It was this excess that I could use to blend out into the arm. I used some Vaseline to prevent the green stuff from sticking and, with my sculpting tool, smoothed out the putty until it blended into the musculature of the arm. I paid close attention to the contours here to ensure that the result would be smooth and undetectable once painted. Similarly, this process was repeated on the right arm's armpit. This was a little trickier as the area to fill was a little bigger, but I followed the existing shapes of the arm and tried to create a realistic dip in the centre. Once I was happy that the gaps had been filled in, I left the green stuff to cure overnight before proceeding to the next few steps. At this stage, the Scout's bolter was missing its magazine. I needed to create something that looked like a traditional bolter, so I took one of the Oculus bolt carbine magazines and clipped away the scope. I trimmed the top flat and then attached it to the bolter to create the classic bolter appearance. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't intend on using the traditional Space Marine power pack. Not only would this not be needed due to the lack of armour that needed powering, but it would have also given Ola's Cole's silhouette too much bulk. But I still needed something to attach to the point where the pack would have gone, so I looked into my Tempestus Science bits box and pulled out a Hotshot Lasgun power pack. This was about the right size for my purposes, and will also help to build up the amount of equipment that the model was carrying. I started by clipping away the pipe before making the surface flat using my knife. I then compared this against the backpack. I could see that it wasn't quite fitting properly, so I made a few more slight trims to both sides of the joint before gluing the pack to the model. So, if you've already seen my previous kill team video, then you probably know what the next step is going to involve. That's right, it's time for handy storage bits. These were used to help build up that more utilitarian aspect of the Raptors that I wanted to convey across the kill team. I started by gluing various pouches around the belt of the model that were sourced from a few different Primaris kits. To continue the narrative of the knife that is being thrown, I also chose to add one of the dual knife pouches from the Intercessor set that was missing its blade. I then took one of the 4 pouch clusters from the Intercessor set and cut it in half along the horizontal seam. This was then cleaned up before being glued to the chest, making the most of that extra space. Finally, Ola's just needed a head. I couldn't really use anything with a full helmet, as this would not only clash against his more lightly armoured appearance, but it would also diverge from the traditional Scout stylings that I was looking to recreate. Ultimately, I settled on this maskless Reaver head, but I didn't glue it to the rest of the model just yet. Instead, I would keep it separate to make things easier to paint. With Ola's Cole built, I next started work on Vicus Cade, the squad's heavy specialist. With the new Heavy Intercessors being added to the Space Marines available unit, Primaris finally have access to an operative that can take the heavy specialism. So naturally, I began by removing the parts required to build a heavy bolter carrying Heavy Intercessor from the sprue before cleaning up the components. My first adjustment was to the chest. Like before, I wanted to remove the existing Aquila motif in order to make room for that extra equipment and to help tone down some of the more decorative parts of the model. I began with my knife, using it to carefully shave away small parts of the design bit by bit. Finally, the surface was smoothed out by holding my blade perpendicular to the surface and dragging it across. This technique scraped away those raised bumps and left me with a smooth armor plate. When it comes to the heavy specialism, there are 2 themes that it conveys. The first being the weapons they carry, and the second being the armor that they wear. To represent this latter aspect, I decided to bulk up the armour around the head a little, and this was achieved with the open face shield of an Inceptor. I began by dry fitting the front and back halves of the torso and comparing the face shield components against them to see how it was currently sitting. From here I could see that both the underside of the face shield and that rear edge at the top would both need some adjustment. I made a couple of small trims with my knife and then compared the fit to see how much more would need to be removed. I repeated this a few times until I was happy with how the extra armour was sitting. These frequent comparisons during these kinds of adjustments are very important for any conversion work that you're doing. It's much better to cut away too little, as this can be resolved easily. Cutting away too much is harder to fix and can often ruin parts. So, take your time. Helmetless heads are a strange contradiction in Space Marines. Wearing excessively heavy armour whilst keeping the most vulnerable part of your body exposed doesn't make the most sense, but helmetless heads are a great way to give your otherwise faceless units a bit of individualism, which is perfect for a kill team. And not even the heavily armoured Ola's Col was an exception to this. I chose a head from the Intercessor kit that featured a mean expression and a couple of scars across one eye for some extra cool points. Normally, I'd like to keep this separate, but once I'd attached the extra armour, I'd have no way of attaching the head afterwards. So I began by assembling the torso and gluing the head into the designated spot. Finally, the extra armour was glued over the top, which inadvertently gave an appearance of a StarCraft Marine. With the head and torso built, I could then add the legs before assembling the heavy bolter. I opted to go with a more generic weapon here, mainly because it offered me a decent rate of fire with some armour piercing, whilst also saving me the princely sum of 1 point, which would pay for an Auspex or a grapnel launcher elsewhere in the team. While a bolter could have sufficed for the armament side of the heavy specialism, I couldn't resist adding a completely superfluous ammo belt. This was sourced from the Intercessor's grenade launcher. In fact, you may remember me cutting this away during my Covered into Fire video some time ago, so always remember to keep hold of these offcuts, as you never know when you might need them. I very carefully bent the strap a little before gluing this to the torso, taking advantage of that smooth, featureless surface. While the heavy Intercessor shoulders are already pretty bulky, I wanted to really go to town on adding that extra armour, so I grabbed a couple of the shoulders from the Aggressor's kit that featured the extended trim. I positioned these so the trim pointed forwards and so helped to give Cade's head that added protection. I did encounter one problem here though. When I came to attach the power pack, I found that as the left arm was being held upwards, the shoulder pad trim was conflicting against the placement of the pack. So I made a few quick trims to the plate before gluing the pack into place. Finally, Cade just needed some pouches to really fit in with his fellow kill team members. I attached various pouches around his waist from the Heavy Intercessor kit and from the regular Tactical Marine kit too, but I opted not to add anything to his power pack as I had done with the other team members. The backpack was already pretty bulky and adding extra equipment here would have probably pushed it a little too close to the overkill side of things, so I left it alone. And with that, all I need to do was to paint and base the two new kill team members, which left me with the following. And here we have both Ola's Col and Vicus Cade, painted up in the colours of the Raptors. While Vicus is mounted on a regular 40mm base, I ultimately decided to play it safe and fit Col with a regular 25mm base rather than a 32mm one. As he stands much taller than a regular Scout, I wanted to avoid any potential gaming problems and to more easily set him apart from his beefier brethren. With the addition of these two new team members, my roster now stands at 7 members. Col could easily be grouped in with my original 5-man team from my first video, but Cade, however, is intended to be swapped out with the last Fusil armed sniper specialist, Tylus Darien. This could be done if I felt my opponent's roster was leaning more towards weight of numbers, where a more consistent rate of fire would be preferable to a single heavy hitting shot. So if you're looking to run Primaris size scouts in your regular 40k games, you could easily apply the techniques that I used to build Col and apply them to a larger squad. And if you haven't already seen my first video, then you can check that out by following the links above and below. As before, it was great fun to work on these extra 2 team members, and you can expect more of these kill team expansion videos in the future. So if you're enjoying these kill team kit bashing videos, Please do leave me a like along with your suggestions for future members or other kill team builds that you'd like to see me tackle in the future. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Stuart Smith, Jeremy Kaup, Jake, Douglas Wilson, and Daniel Dowling. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee or you just use my affiliates links. Your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these different kinds of conversions for you. If you'd like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all the relevant links, and so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.